Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Samara Weaving and Zazie Beetz have to survive the night against a group of Satanists out to kill them in two different films. But to quote Harry Hill, which is better, Ready or Not 2, or They Will Kill You? There's only one way to find out. Fight! Ready or Not, Here I Come picks up right where the first film left off, with Samara Weaving's Grace being taken to hospital, encountering her estranged sister Faith, played by Catherine Newton. But they're soon both kidnapped, as by surviving the Domeless family, Grace has triggered a second game of hide and seek, this time against the other families of the council, to win the high seat and a ring that rules the world. Hunted and handcuffed to Faith, Grace must try and survive until dawn. Again. Meanwhile, and They Will Kill You, Zazie Beetz' Asia Reeves has just been released from prison and takes a job as a housekeeper in prestigious New York apartment building, The Virgil. But on her first night, Asia is attacked by a satanic cult led by Patricia Arquette's Lilith, who intends to make her their latest sacrifice. But Asia is far from helpless, and she has her own reasons for being at The Virgil. Now, you might be familiar with a phenomenon called twin films, which is when two separate movies get made about the same subject that are very similar and end up being released roughly around the same time as each other. Sometimes it's by happenstance, sometimes it's deliberate, and I'm sure you can think of a few classic examples. Armageddon and Deep Impact, Volcano and Dante's Peak, Ants and A Bug's Life, and that time we had two movies about Christopher Robin, but normally these films are spaced out a bit so they don't actively confuse and undercut each other with audiences, because that's just bad for business. So I have never seen a situation quite like what we have here, where we have two action horror comedies about a female protagonist who has to melee her way through the Satanists trying to kill her. These are both being actively promoted at the same time and released only a week apart. Hell, I only saw them days apart at two sneak preview screenings. In fact, when I went and saw Send Help, I even got the trailers back to back, to which my friend leaned in and said, "Is it me, or did we get the same trailer twice?" And he wasn't wrong, they're extremely similar. So much so that Ready or Not 2 has actually shifted release dates a few times, as it was originally due in April, and then on the same date as They Will Kill You, and then finally moved to the week before, seemingly to get the jump on the other. It's a battle to the death at the box office almost as much as the films themselves, and rather than do two virtually identical reviews, I figured it would make more sense to talk about both of them and compare them. So may the best final girl win. Ready or Not, Here I Come, to give its full correct title, which I won't use again because it's a bit too long-winded, does feel a little belated as a follow-up coming 7 years after the first film. Obviously the reason why is that everyone's been very busy since, as it was the breakout movie for Samara Weaving, who has become a hugely prolific Scream queen, and for Radio Silence, who went on to direct the 5th and 6th Scream films, and Weaving was the opening kill in the latter, and the vampire flick Abigail. That last one, with an ensemble group of thieves locked in a house, already felt like the spiritual successor to Ready or Not in terms of premise and execution anyway, especially by repeating the gag of having characters explode into bloody messes, which has since become Radio Silence's trademark. And even Radio Silence themselves weren't involved in developing a sequel for a long time, until they started working on a movie for both Weaving and Catherine Newton from Abigail to do together, and a few calls later, it got folded into the Ready or Not world. But in addition to Weaving and the director's return, the producing team and the original film's writers, Guy Busick and R. Christopher Murray, are also back for the sequel too. I actually rewatched Ready or Not, and it still holds up, although it was a bit more restrained than I remember it being. I always remembered it as being a bloodbath because that very memorable finale, but that's literally at the very end. It's the cathartic punchline to a long joke. There's a few other gruesome bits, but it's mostly about mixing suspense with a lot of humour about the Domeless family and how inept they are at playing their own game, constantly bickering amongst themselves. I think you can make the argument that the first Ready or Not might be one of the most influential horror films of the last decade, because so many since have tried to emulate its mixture of dark comedy with genuine horror with a dash of social commentary, which itself owes a little bit of a debt to Get Out. And a movie like They Will Kill You definitely makes an argument for Ready or Not significance, as you can draw a very direct line from it, and even a few moments apparently taken from it. There's a bit where Zazie Beetz, punches out a kid after they attack her, and there's an almost identical moment in Ready or Not. That being said, They Will Kill You is clearly inspired by a whole range of other films as well, and we'll get to more of those in a bit, and that includes You're Next, which likely helped inspire Ready or Not in the first place. They Will Kill You is notably produced by brother and sister duo Andy and Barbara Muschietti under their new production label Nocturna. You might recall that Andy Muschietti directed the It films, which Warner Bros. Have been selling it on in their marketing. He also directed The Flash, but we try not to talk about that too much. It's helmed by Russian director Kirill Sokolov, who also co-wrote the script and is making his Hollywood debut, having been known for the cult hit Why Don't You Just Die? If you're familiar with that, then you might have a good idea of what Kirill is bringing to the table and the things that will set it apart from Ready or Not. Ready or Not 2 is clearly a sequel that is aware of its own ridiculousness. Apparently Radio Silence directors Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Taylor Gillett did write a teaser for a potential sequel when they made the first film that hinted at a larger universe, but they cut it, and they were right to do so at the time, as that movie has a great final scene, and Ready or Not could have been left as a one and done with a self-contained story. There wasn't really a need for a sequel, but it tries to make the fact that it's so unnecessary part of the joke. Even the choice to pick up directly from where it left off is a brave choice, although it also adds to the absurdity of going through it all over again, as it continues on to show Grace collapsing and having to be revived in the ambulance on her way to the hospital. This is purely to get her patched up a bit. You might remember that she got shot through the hand and stabbed in the shoulder before the chaos starts up again. The big wink of how contrived and ridiculous this whole thing is when Grace is forced to put on a bloodied, torn up wedding dress back on from the evidence bag with a half-hearted excuse, there's no time to find any clothes, and filmed like a superhero getting into their battle armour, complete with those yellow Converses. It's completely preposterous. That's why it's funny. And Ready or Not 2 is definitely a classic example of a sequel, the same thing done on a bigger scale and more of it, almost like the Home Alone 2 of Splatterfest. Did you like the bloody combustion gag at the end of the first flick? Well, we get it right from the very start here and several more times, and there's scarcely a moment where Weaving and Newton aren't being freshly lacquered in other people's blood. It's no bad thing, the excess is the point, although you might feel by the end that Radio Silence has got as much mileage out of this gag as they possibly can across 3 films now. Am I likely showing behind the scenes footage of them filming these scenes because I can't actually show them if I want this video to be monetized? Probably. But expanding out the world does have its pros and cons in much the same way it did for John Wick. Now we have a whole council of families who have all pledged themselves to Mrs. LaBelle, with a fun cameo from David Cronenberg as the head of the Danforth family who rules over the world. He's introduced watching a war on TV with no sign of ceasefire until he calls up and instantly makes it happen, a moment which I don't think was meant to be as topical as it plays right now at this very moment. His twin children, Sarah Michelle Gellar's Ursula and Sean Hattese's Titus, are among those competing in the game, and the whole thing takes place on their estate and hotel. Both Gellar and Hattese are clearly relishing being bad. If you've seen Cruel Intentions, you'll know that Gellar is at her most fun when she's being wicked, and I'm sure having to wield a stake brought back plenty of Buffy flashbacks. But it's Hattese that stands out in the pair as the insecure male heir who starts out as an arrogant dick and then gradually peels back the layers to reveal just how much of a nasty piece of work he truly is. And the sequel expands its satire of the elites by aiming squarely, but rather appropriately right now, at oligarchy and their insidious control over the world. So yeah, we got 4 new families now. There's also the El Cadio family, led by Lester Carmenel's Ignacio, the Wans, led by Olivia Cheng Zhen Jing, and the Rajans, led by Nadim Umar Kitab's Viraj. Okay, technically there's 5, as Abigail scene stealer Kevin Durand represents the Wilkinsons, but he doesn't really stick around very long in what is basically a cameo. If you saw the trailer, you probably knew that. So while that does mean we get a bunch of new characters in infighting, Varun Saranga gets some laughs as the cowardly Madhu Rajan who tries to avoid getting in battle, the downside is that the film has to set up and introduce all of them, and that means that while the film tries to get a running start, it's soon slowed down by the hurdles of exposition. Much of it is delivered by Elijah Wood's lawyer, who's there to lay out the rules and contractual obligations with a slightly deranged officiousness. And while it is delivered with a smirk, there is still an extremely lengthy scene where all the characters have to have everything explained to them, on top of the opening scenes where Grace recaps the whole previous movie for Faith and the audience members who didn't see it. The first film also took a bit of time to get started, but that was building suspense and tension in the lead up. This, however, is more just bloat. And while the Domus family weren't all fully sketched out, there's now too many characters, something that's even acknowledged by a rule that if they kill a member of a competing family, everyone in the offending bloodline goes splat. That's a Chekhov's gun if I ever heard one, and clearly there to thin out the ranks, although admittedly one of the sequel's funniest bits. But this all speaks to the unevenness of the second film, which is broader but only works in fits and starts. They Will Kill You, on the other hand, has considerably less baggage, but that doesn't mean its world building isn't any less flawed. That delivers its exposition between action set pieces largely in crucial flashbacks, parceling out information that recontextualizes the narrative. The apartment building setting of the Virgil has some fun ideas, but it feels like it got a little bit lost in the shuffle. The movie introduces the idea that every flaw is somehow themed around a deadly sin by having a flaw of lust, but then that's almost quickly forgotten about. Likewise, there's some interesting hints about the building's history, especially with Patricia Arquette's Lilith and Passon Joseph's Ray, an interracial couple from the early 20th century, and the implication is that they chose to live in the Virgil to protect themselves from prejudice of the time. That's an interesting idea, but not one that's fully explored. I also have to give a bit of a mention to Arquette's attempt at an Irish accent, which is, not good. Like, it took me most of the film to realise this was supposed to be Irish bad. Arquette's a fantastic actor, but that brogue is a distracting misjudgment. The film opens with a quote from Cellini: "When the poor give to the rich, the devil smiles." And that sets up that it's going to be a vicious allegory, but again, only in the broadest strokes. The first level is for the housekeeping staff, who are aware and complicit in the Satanists' activities, and many near sacrifices themselves. But the themes of class and race, the people that enable cruel hierarchies if it protects themselves, isn't fully fleshed out either. And the actual story of They Will Kill You is its weakest part, as it does feel like the script needed a few more drafts to make the commentary more prominent and coherent, something which the Ready or Not films are better at. The Satanists are a bit Ready or Not coded as well, in that they're a bit bumbling, although in this case it's more because they're not actually used to a quarry that fights back, which catches them by surprise. Heather Graham's beauty guru Shannon and Tom Felton's Kevin are among the Satanists in pursuit of Asia, and both are game. That's especially true for Graham, in her most prominent role in years, who puts herself in a lot of the stunts and comedy and gets some of the worst carnage inflicted upon her. Just as committed as always is Ready or Not 2's Samara Weaving, who adds a weary, battle-hardened edge to her reprisal. In the first film she was more naive and trying to make a good impression, but this time she doesn't give a damn and is determined to survive, because if she did it once, she can bloody well do it again. Weaving's howling scream has been pretty iconic in its own right, but she's an excellent comic performer, even managing to score chuckles with her expressions in close-ups. But the sequel escalates this up to buddy comedy by teaming her up with fellow rising horror star Catherine Newton. The existence of a sister is a bit of a retcon. The first film stated that Grace didn't have a family, having gone through the foster system, hence why she so wanted to be accepted by the Ladomuses. This sequel tries to tweak that, so now they were both foster children, but Grace moved to New York when she was just 18, and Faith felt she was abandoned, and has only been brought back into her life because she was still listed as her emergency contact. I didn't mind this, because I was excited when I heard that Newton was going to be in the sequel, because she excelled in horror comedies like Freaky and Abigail. It should be a great combination, but I felt that Newton was strangely underutilised here. Faith is mostly a reactive character, which makes sense, as she's effectively how Grace was in the first one, given she's been dragged in the middle of this mess with no idea what's going on. And Newton does get a few amusing moments as a foil to Weaving, responding to the insanity, especially people blowing up in front of her. But I wish she got a few more standout moments of her own, as too often she exists to be helpless, and even spends most of the film's finale just standing around on the sidelines doing nothing. And as a double act, too much of the interaction between Grace and Faith is them bickering and arguing about their past, which again stops the movie cold when it should be moving when things are life and death. They're trying to go for this found family angle, but their backstory is too cliche to land emotionally when their dynamic should have leaned more towards comedy. It's not really the performer's fault, the script should have given them more. Zazie Beetz in They Will Kill You is also intensely dedicated, and it's honestly the kind of role I've been waiting for her to get for years. Beetz first caught my attention back in Deadpool 2, and I've often described her as perennially underutilised, as she kept getting stuck in these underdeveloped supporting roles that didn't make use of her charisma. But in this movie though, she's ferocious, as she puts herself through scene after scene of intense choreography. It's actually her first lead role, and she seizes it with both hands, managing to be tough but also protective, and there's a definite echo of Pam Grier in her performance. In yet another link between the two films, They Will Kill You is also about sisterhood, as Asia is out to rescue her sister Maria, played by myha'la from the show Industry, whether she wants to or not. And it's strange to say that this movie handles the estranged sister plotline better than Ready or Not 2 does, but the relationship between them feels better integrated into the narrative and feels more like the crux of it rather than halting its momentum. The difference is that the story is about Maria, whereas Faith just happens to be there at the time. Where the second Ready or Not feels more confident than its predecessor is in the action sequences, which are much bigger and more accomplished. That's partly down to Radio Silence getting better as directors, but also because this is bigger in scale. As I say, there's more explosions of many kinds. I think the best moment in the sequel is easily the fight scene between Grace and Maya J's Francesca, loaded with physical comedy from both participants being pepper sprayed and fumbling around, certainly enough to provide a counterbalance to the fight scene that Faith has at the same time, which is easily one of the film's darkest moments, cross-cutting between comic violence and nastier, more sustained and realistic violence. But that mixing of tones does mean that when the movie goes darker in a final third, which tries to tie things up full circle, it again feels like it slows down where it should be powering towards a big finish. It does eventually get there, but it does wobble a little bit towards the end. But action is clearly where They Will Kill You most excels, because Sokolov directs the hell out of this movie. It's clearly an extremely horror-literate film. The premise, inspired by his own experiences of living in an apartment building, is also inspired by Rosemary's Baby. There's a kid named Damien, and it has the feeling of 70s exploitation cinema. But maybe that's because it owes such a gigantic debt to Tarantino, especially Kill Bill, particularly with blood squirting out of severed limbs and some of the foot stuff. Although I suppose the fact that Asia has to battle through without her destroyed shoes is also a nod to Die Hard, although it more often reminded me of something like The Raid. The fight scenes are amazingly photographed, particularly the first in Asia's room, with the camera gliding through the action, using movement in place of rapid cuts. That allows you to see all the careful choreography and gags in a clean, dynamic way that's hugely enjoyable, almost resembling a side-scrolling beat-em-up at times. Sokolov's use of the camera is extremely inventive and playful, giving a highly pulpy and stylized feel to the material. The fight scene in the dining room, bringing a new meaning to the term fire axe, is also a memorably staged showdown as a piece of visual storytelling. And because the Satanists are effectively immortal, regenerating after losing their heads and limbs, it quickly becomes like a violent cartoon as they keep coming back for more and refusing to die. The action scenes are gloriously OTT and excessive, and there's almost a bit of a Raimi edge to the humour, especially in one sequence involving a severed eyeball roaming around of its own accord, which is delightfully daffy. But like Ready or Not 2, They Will Kill You does begin to fatigue as it gets into the home stretch, mostly because it does start to become a little bit repetitive by the time of the finale, or maybe that's just a bit of exhaustion from it being so fast and frenzied from beginning to end. But as an action fan, I was mostly highly entertained. So which do I like better? Honestly, neither of them are bad. They're both fun and flawed, and they would make a good double feature with each other, although maybe have a couple of hours gap between them first. Ready or Not 2 is more of the same, for better and for worse, trying to top the previous film, and the results are a bit more uneven, but it does have some great bits in it. but I did think by the end of it that it had stretched the concept as far as it could possibly go, particularly in the latter half, and there was something about it that just left me feeling slightly underwhelmed. To my surprise, the one that I enjoyed most out of the pair was They Will Kill You, which I definitely did not expect. Yes, it's derivative, but it's also completely crazy and directed with such verve and wit. Yes, it does have the weaker script, but it also has some incredible fight scenes, and I'm just a sucker for that kind of thing. It has the energy of a proper Midnight Madness movie, and if you can, try to see it, or both of them, in the grungiest cinema you can, with a crowd. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip on my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can help slay the evil forces of the algorithm by joining my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and hype the video. It really does make a difference. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.